Welcome to the Pioneer Podcast. This is Ernst Roots. Today's episode of the Pioneer Podcast is a special episode because I want to use this opportunity to do some housekeeping. And what I mean by that is that we will be discussing some more internal aspects of this podcast and of the institution, Lex Libertas, that we have recently announced in a more finalized version of the Pioneer Initiative. And so usually for these podcasts, we either do interviews or monologues, with regard to which we spend a lot of time for preparation. Today's episode is not a text that I will read to you or something to that effect, but I do have some loose notes to guide me through this conversation to make sure that we will be getting to the most important parts of what ought to be discussed. But the crux of the matter is that with this episode, I want to speak with you about where we are with a special focus on a behind-the-scenes perspective. In other words, what we have done over the last few months since the first announcement of the Pioneer Initiative on the 7th of March, 2025, which is not yet 100 days ago, what we are currently doing, and what we plan on doing as far as the road ahead is concerned. By now, you would know that the name has changed, and it's not so much that the name of the organization has changed from the Pioneer Initiative to Lex Libertas. It's much rather that when we announced the Pioneer Initiative, you might recall, if you have already been involved since then, that we did announce this initiative in a very preliminary form with somewhat of a vague structure to provide people with the opportunity to become involved from the get-go so that they can give inputs as far as the policy framework, the institutional framework, the name, and so forth are concerned. And we are very grateful for the extent to which we have gotten input from our contributors. In fact, when we announced quite early on in the process that the name Pioneer Initiative is a placeholder name and we would like input with regard to the name, we got more than 50 name suggestions within 2 days from people suggesting certain names. Now, I'm going to get back to the name, why we chose the name Lex Libertas, and what the name means, because there are some important points to make in this regard. So it's not so much that the name of the organization has changed as it is that the organization was announced in a very preliminary form. You would know that this podcast is called the Pioneer Podcast, which is why we chose the Pioneer Initiative for the initial name, and that the organization has now reached the point where we can present it in a more final form with a more comprehensive policy framework. So to put this in different words, what I want to do with this episode is speak casually or informally about three things. And so if you watch this episode or listen to this episode to the end, you would be fairly well up to speed with these three things. The first is philosophical, or put differently, our frame of reference as far as our set of ideas are concerned. So what is the philosophy behind this organization? How do we think about problems? And how do we think about solutions? The second point or category that I want to discuss is institutional. In other words, the institution itself, Lex Libertas as an organization, which could be described as a vehicle or the vehicle that carries this philosophy or this set of ideas. So I want to discuss some institutional aspects of the organization to make sure that you, the viewer or the listener, understands the organization for what it is, for what it seeks to achieve, for how it will operate, and also, importantly, for what it is not. And then the third part that I want to discuss is practically. So once we have discussed the broad philosophy and we have discussed the institution, the third point is the road, how we intend to move this institution and those who are involved or those who support this institution towards its destination. So it will be a practical conversation, how we foresee this organization will operate, including some remarks on how you can become more involved. So if we were to start with some remarks about the philosophy of Lex Libertas, you would have heard us say, if you have been following, that it's no surprise that South Africa has a crisis, but that it is important to understand this crisis, to make sense of this crisis for what it is and for what it is not. Now, I recently watched a speech by a political commentator here in South Africa whose views I greatly admire and respect, who spoke about the crisis in South Africa and who said that we, at the end of the day, have to choose between two options. The one option is to flee, and the other option is to fight. So we need to choose between fight or flight, to put it in those terms. And this is obviously true. We don't really have the luxury of being bystanders in what is happening in South Africa. But what was a bit concerning to me was the description of the fight that followed. And so this analyst, as do many analysts in South Africa, then explained that the most important fight is the fight against the ANC. It's the fight to get the ANC out of power, to get a different party into power. And from a more philosophical perspective, this is not quite the argument of Lex Libertas. Obviously, as we have said, and we will continue to say, the ANC is a destructive force in South Africa, trying to implement policy ideas that would so obviously be to the disadvantage of everyone who lives in South Africa. Yet, what we do say at Lex Libertas is that the crisis that we see and experience with the ANC government is not so much the crisis itself, but rather a symptom of a deeper rooted crisis. And what we mean by that is that the problem, firstly, is not that the wrong person is the president of South Africa. Secondly, the problem is not that the wrong party won the election. Now think about that for a moment. Whichever party you voted for in the last election, if you participated in the election, if you voted, think about this party, which I assume you voted for because you think it's the best option. What would happen if this party were to win the election and if the leader of this party were to become the president of South Africa? I'm convinced that you would believe that things would be better, and you might be right. But if you take a moment to think about the underlying structural institutional problems within South Africa, it doesn't take much thinking to conclude that many, if not most, of the deeper rooted problems that we experience in South Africa would not go away if another party were to take power. So yes, we can have a better party in power, but we must not be naive to think that the fundamental, deeper rooted crises that we experience in South Africa would go away under the leadership of a different party. And so this is why, philosophically, our frame of reference and our approach, or our starting block, is that the problems in South Africa are deeper rooted than the government. It is rooted in a structural problem. And when we say that, what we mean is we need to recognize that South Africa is a very big country compared to other countries all over the world. And not only is South Africa very big, it is a very diverse country. And we have spoken about this quite a lot, and we will continue to do so. And so then the question arises, what is a sustainable political solution for a country that is very big and very diverse? We're not speaking about Canada or Russia. We're talking about a country that, even though it is smaller than these countries, it is very diverse. It is more diverse than Western Europe, for example. And our fundamental starting point is that the only way to truly cater for a territory this big that is as diverse as this country is to have a decentralized political system, to ensure that the country or the territory does not have a system in which one party has the potential or the capacity to seize power, to implement destructive ideological ideas at the expense of everyone. That democracy is not merely a race-based census, but that the approach is that the government must be much closer to the people. So what we are advocating for, in other words, is a political system that is decentralized, in other words, with a central government that has significantly less power, but also that is based on the notion of self-governance. Now, the term self-governance has become a controversial term, such as the word self-determination, when these words or terms are perfectly legitimate. There's nothing wrong. In fact, it's a healthy, normal thing for any community to say, we want to have a degree of self-governance. We want to decide over our own affairs. We want to decide what our children will be taught in our schools, and so forth. But unfortunately, within South Africa and the South African context, we have been taught and we have been convinced to a very large extent that there are only two options at our disposal. We either have the apartheid system or the ANC government with its National Democratic Revolution. And so we have been told that if you disagree with the underlying structure or system that we have in South Africa, that by definition means that you want to go back to the apartheid system. And they have done this by discrediting terms such as self-governance, which we do not have under the ANC government, and by trying to convince us that if you pursue something to this effect, that means that you want to go back to the past. Our approach is that we should learn from the past, that there is much wisdom in the past, but that we do not want to return to the past. Because if we compare these two systems, the apartheid system and the current ANC government, what these two systems have in common is that they are both deeply centralized systems with a very strong central government. And what we are saying is that we need to move towards something else, something other than this. So at Lex Libertas, or formerly the Pioneer Initiative, we will be outspoken about policy issues, about the dangers of expropriation without compensation, of hate speech and so forth. But this is not our core focus. Our core focus is not to combat destructive policy ideas. It is to advocate and work towards a better, more sustainable political system in South Africa. And so in as far we speak about these ideas or these destructive ideas, it will be to point out that these are the symptoms or the consequences of a deeper rooted problem in South Africa. Now, part of the central focus of Lex Libertas is the notion of freedom. That is what the word libertas means. And philosophically, this is an important topic for this institution as well, to discuss freedom. What does it mean to be free? And in our day and age, this is especially important. It would be very difficult to find someone who disagrees with the notion that freedom is a good thing. But in our day and age, our notion or our conception of freedom has become very corrupted by modern ideologies who are trying to present the idea of freedom as merely the freedom to do whatever you want to do. While at Lex Libertas, our conception of freedom is more based on the classical conception, the Christian conception, the conception of freedom that originated in Athens and Rome, and that became the foundation of Western civilization. And what do we mean by that? Or what is the difference between our modern conception of freedom and our classical conception of freedom? Now, there is much to be said about this, but there are some fundamental differences. One difference is that the classical conception of freedom is based first and foremost on the notion of responsibility. Freedom is something that you achieve if you fulfill your responsibilities, while the modern conception is fundamentally antagonistic towards the idea of responsibility. Because in the modern conception of freedom, telling someone that they have responsibilities is interpreted as a violation of the freedom of that person. But the classical conception of freedom is much more and much more deeper rooted than simply emphasizing responsibilities. It is a conception of freedom that places a significant emphasis on the community, or the polis, as it was called in Athens, or Greece instead, or the republic, as it was called in Rome. The idea that a community has a particular identity. And this was very much discussed by ancient or classical thinkers, people like Plato, Aristotle in Greece, people like Cicero in Rome, and people like Paul and many of the apostles in the New Testament. What does it mean to be free? And it is very clear that from the classical conception, the idea of freedom is attached to the idea of promoting what is good, not just doing whatever you want. But the idea of freedom in the classical conception is also that an individual cannot be free if the community of which that individual is part is not free. And a community cannot be free if the individuals that are part of that community or the citizens of that community aren't free. So it's about striking a balance between individual freedom and communal freedom. And this is important because it boils down to a very important contentious issue in contemporary political discourse, which is the matter or the question of culture. Now, today it is controversial to talk about culture, but we need to return to cultural solutions because culture is the foundation on which communities are built. So at the Pioneer Initiative, we are not involved with debates about which culture is best and so forth, but we are involved with a pursuit to say that a very important part of the solution lies in returning to culture and in promoting a healthy, sustainable culture within the context of a political system or dispensation that is decentralized and that enables self-governance for communities. So those are some broad remarks as far as the philosophy is concerned. Let's talk about some institutional aspects. And by institutional aspects, I mean Lex Libertas, the organization, where we are, what we have been doing, and what we intend to do. So the Pioneer Initiative was launched, as I mentioned already, in a formal or informal, rather, preliminary phase on the 7th of March, 2025, with not much of a policy framework, but with a vision statement. We encouraged people to become involved, and if you did become involved back then, you would know and you would attest to the fact that we have had many engagement with our contributors, for which we are very grateful because we have received some really good inputs from our contributors as far as suggestions are concerned for the policy framework, suggestions for the name, slogans, structuring the organization, and so forth. And so much of the past month or 2 months was spent on structuring the organization so that it could be launched in a more final form, which is what we did on the 15th of May, 2025, when we announced the name Lex Libertas and a policy framework that is attached to the organization. At this launch event, we spoke quite a bit about what's happening in the world, how we see our place in the world, how we see our role or our calling, and also what the organization intends to do. So I would encourage you to go and watch the speeches that were made at the launch event. And so with that in mind, we have decided on the name Lex Libertas for the organization. And there are some important reasons for this. The word or the name Lex Libertas literally translated means law and freedom, or the law of freedom. Libertas meaning freedom and lex meaning law. Now, when we call the organization Lex Libertas, there are two things that we mean by this. In the one hand, it says something about the destination that we seek to achieve, the guiding principle that we are working towards, which is a constitutional framework that enables freedom, or put differently, a legal system, a law in the broad sense of the word, that enables people to be free. But other than that, the name also says something about the internal workings of the organization. If we use the term Lex Libertas to refer to the organization itself, what we mean by that is the lex on which the institution is founded is libertas. In other words, the notion of freedom, the notion of the promotion of freedom is the guiding principle on which we are founded, the guiding principle that will always indicate to us what the core focus of this organization is. So while we are guided by the principle of freedom, the destination that we want to achieve is a legal system or a constitutional dispensation that enables higher levels of freedom. Now, let's make some quick remarks about what the organization is not. It's not a political party. You will not be able to vote for us in elections. We will certainly not endorse political parties. There will be some parties with which we have higher levels of agreement and others with regard to which we will have higher levels of disagreement. But that is not our focus. It is not our game. It is not the sphere in which we operate. It is also not an organization that will focus on community organizing. There is extremely important work that has to be done in terms of organizing communities, as other institutions are already doing. Organizing communities into being more actively involved in their towns or their cities, in their local communities, through safety initiatives, through fixing problems where they live, and so forth. But this is not our focus, as our focus is much more macro-political. Now, we have gotten many emails and messages from people asking what can they do to become more involved there where they live, in their local community. They don't want to just contribute to the organization, they want to do something actively. And so we are working towards rolling some more practical measures out in this regard. But the focus would not be on community organizing. It would be on practical things that people can do and practical ways in which people can contribute to this guiding principle, to this end goal that we wish to achieve. Now, as far as the organization is concerned, there is much to do, and this links to the question of what could people do. But I have to say, as far as our goals are concerned, the first and most important goal for now is to get the institution financially sustainable. So we are dependent on contributions from members of the public within South Africa or abroad, outside of South Africa. And we are very grateful for the support we have gotten from people who do not live in South Africa as well. So the most important thing that you can do at the moment is to encourage people to contribute, to become contributors to Lex Libertas. If they don't want to contribute, that's fine. Then at least I would encourage them to sign up to our newsletter so that they can be more actively involved or at least up to date with what we are doing. We don't issue newsletters for the sake of issuing newsletters, but when there is something to say that is important, and if you are already subscribed to our newsletter, you will know that it is always short and to the point with a link for more information on that particular topic if you are interested. So encouraging people to preferably contribute to the organization would benefit this institution a lot. If they're not interested in that, or if they are hesitant or still thinking about that, at least encouraging them to sign up for the newsletter would help a lot. And so our goal, other than financial sustainability, is to broaden our networks, to have a much more deeper-rooted network of like-minded people within South Africa and outside of South Africa. That includes people who contribute to our work, but it also includes people who are involved with other institutions that are in some ways like-minded, whether that is in South Africa or outside of South Africa. So broadening the network is especially important. And if you, as the viewer or the listener, can contribute in that sense, that would also help us a lot. And then to get more people actively, tangibly involved, we will start arranging events and we will invite you to participate in these events. Practically, and that is the final point that I want to discuss, other than the broad philosophy that we are based on and the institution itself, what is it that we intend to do? Now, this, in a certain sense, is a difficult question to answer, but it's also a very easy question to answer. Now, the first and most important thing to say, as we have been saying all along and will continue to say, is that we do not believe in quick fixes, we do not believe in silver bullets, and we do not believe in final solutions. There is not much that we can do today that would create some form of a long-term solution tomorrow. This is something that could much rather be described as a journey towards a solution than some radical interference today to create that solution. But we know that we can, through our actions, make things better or worse. And our goal is to make things better through our actions. Now, a question that we do get a lot is, how will we achieve this tangible action? How will we achieve a better constitutional dispensation if the government or those in power in the government doesn't agree that this has to be achieved? Now, it's an important question, but we would do well to remember that significant constitutional changes almost never happens with the approval of those in power at the time. The National Party would not have agreed to ending their control, but they were forced by circumstances to do this. And so in the South African context, it is already quite clear that the system is crumbling. But a system cannot crumble forever. A crumbling system usually leads to some form of a change. And so it's reasonable to predict that South Africa is going to change. And it is our role to influence this change when it happens, so that it is a change for the better. Now the question becomes, how do we do that? And broadly speaking, at Lex Libertas, we believe that we can do this through a combination of three things. So if you were to read our vision statement, in other words, the vision that we foresee, what is it that we want to achieve, it's quite simple. It is a more sustainable political dispensation for the communities of South Africa. How do we want to achieve that? In other words, what do we say in our mission statement? It is through a combination of three things that we have spoken about in the past, but we will continue to speak about this. The first is thinking about solutions. Now, we might think that thinking sounds boring or unimportant, but thinking is a fundamental part of our solution. So in a certain sense, Lex Libertas will function as a think tank. What we mean by thinking is doing research and thinking creatively about solutions. Thinking about new ideas, what can be done in terms of what the end destination is, but also what can be done to achieve that. So thinking implies thinking about the destination, and it also implies thinking about what ought to be done to achieve this destination. And this will be a continuous central focus at Lex Libertas. But as we have said in the past, thinking alone is not enough. We need to speak about these ideas. And speaking is especially important because when you speak, you are forced to put your ideas into words, which is a very important thought process. But we need to speak about our ideas because we need to convince others of these ideas. Firstly, when you engage in the battle of ideas through speaking, you force yourself to be confronted by counter-arguments, which is to your benefit because that will force you to rethink your position. And if your position or your idea can withstand counter-arguments, you are stronger as a result of it. If it cannot withstand counter-arguments, that by definition means that it wasn't a good idea from the get-go. So we need to talk about these ideas, firstly, because putting our ideas into words is an important part of the process, but secondly, because by speaking about this, we garner support. We rally more people to our side. We convince people of these ideas. And especially because we believe that the ideas that we need to think about has to be creative ideas. We need to think outside of the box. It is so important to talk about these ideas and get people excited about them. That brings us to the third aspect, which is doing. Now, sometimes on social media, when we have a conversation about a topic, you would see someone respond with something like, well, you guys are just talking. We need to do something. And in a certain sense, that is correct. But it is also a wrong thought process to reach that conclusion, because we need to think, and we need to speak, and we need to do continuously. When we say we need to take action, we mean that we need these ideas and these messages that we convey to find practical application in the real world. Now, on a micro sense, that implies a lot of things. It implies arranging conferences. It implies speaking events, many activities on ground level. But on a macro scale, it implies building a movement that agrees with the idea that this country needs dispensational change. And so we do not think of thinking, speaking, and doing as three separate things. We do not think of it as a process, a one-dimensional process, but as a cycle, a reinforcing cycle. And on the road to achieving this, we believe the most important three things that we need to do is thinking creatively about solutions, speaking about these solutions, encouraging support for these solutions, and finding tangible ways in which we can promote these things in the real world. So with that, I will conclude by inviting you to become a contributor to Lex Libertas if you are not already one. There is a link in the description, or by thanking you for your contribution to this institution if you are in fact already one. The most important thing that we need to do at the moment, once again, is to get the institution financially sustainable, to get more people to sign up, to become actively involved, based on which we certainly have a lot of work to do. Thank you very much.